All right, everybody. So today we're going to look at a couple of Supreme Court cases that dealt with the issue of federalism. And we're going to use the same format as we look at all of the 15 required cases that'll show up on your AP exam. So since this is the first one we'll be doing in depth, I wanted to go over some expectations for each of the different sections that you need to complete. There is a completed version of Marbury versus Madison saved into the Unit 1 folder on Schoology as well. I know we just kind of talked through that case in class, but if you would like to save that one, download it so that you have all of these 15 cases in the same exact format, by all means, please do so. The first case we're going to look at together here is McCulloch versus Maryland, and then I'll let you guys do U.S. versus Lopez on your own. So the first thing we're going to do is open up the hyperlink here, and we're going to open the first one. So this top one that says McCulloch versus Maryland 1819. And that's going to bring us to this street law overview of the case. So this is the same sort of thing we looked at with Marbury versus Madison. Now I'm going to try and split screen here so we can see both of these at the same time. So the first thing is going to be your background of the case. So we'll kind of make this bigger for a minute. So it says, in 1791, the first Bank of the United States was established to serve as a central bank for the country. It was a place for storing government funds, collecting taxes, and issuing sound currency. At the time it was created, the government was in its infancy, and there was a great deal of debate over exactly how much power the national government should have. In particular, many individuals focused on the fact that the Constitution did not expressly grant the power to Congress to charter corporations or banks. Many thought that the only way to justify the federal government's creation of a central bank would be to interpret the Constitution as giving the federal government implied powers. This idea of implied powers worried many individuals who feared that this interpretation of the Constitution, providing implied powers, would create an all-powerful national government that would threaten the presumed sovereignty of states. The debate about the constitutionality of the first bank was intense. Some people, such as Alexander Hamilton, argued for the supremacy of the national government in a broad interpretation of its powers, which would include the ability to establish a bank. Others, such as Thomas Jefferson, advocated states' rights, limited government, and a narrower interpretation of the national government's powers under the Constitution, and therefore no bank. While James Madison was president, the first bank's charter was not renewed. Congress proposed the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. President Madison, who was a staunch opponent of the creation of the first bank, approved the charter, believing that its constitutionality had been settled by prior practices and understanding. The Second Bank established branches throughout the United States. Many states opposed opening branches of this bank within their boundaries for several reasons. First, the Bank of the United States competed with their own banks. At this point in history, there was no single currency in the United States, and each state issued its own money. And the Bank of the United States also had authority to issue currency. Second, the states found many of the managers of the Second Bank to be corrupt. Third, the states felt that the federal government was exerting too much power over them by attempting to curtail the state practice of issuing more paper money than there was able to redeem on demand. Alright, so next we're going to look at the facts of the case. It says Maryland attempted to close the Baltimore branch of the National Bank by passing a law that forced all banks chartered outside of the state to pay a yearly tax. The Second Bank was the only such bank in the state. James McCulloch, the chief administrative officer for the Baltimore branch, refused to pay the tax. The state of Maryland sued McCulloch, saying that Maryland had the power to tax any business in its state and that the Constitution does not give Congress the power to create a national bank. McCulloch was convicted, but he appealed the decision to the Maryland Court of Appeals. His attorneys argued that the establishment of a national bank was a necessary and proper function of Congress, one of the many implied but not explicitly stated powers in the Constitution. The Maryland Court of Appeals ruled in favor of Maryland, and McCulloch appealed again. The case was heard by the Supreme Court. So that's where we're going to stop for part 1. Anything that you include in part 1 of the worksheet needs to come from those two sections, the background or the facts of the case. I do not want anything in part 1 about what the Supreme Court actually decided. So in part 1 here, let's move this over. We're going to summarize the arguments or the issues that led to the controversy using this somebody wanted but so method. So for somebody, we're going to put our subjects. Now, I would always suggest using your subjects that are the subjects in the case for the first 2 sentences at least. So our subjects in this case are McCulloch and Maryland. So we kind of talk about Maryland first. So I think I'll start with that sentence. It says here that Maryland attempted to close the Baltimore branch of the National Bank by forcing all banks outside of the state to pay a yearly tax. I can also assume that Maryland was one of the many states that opposed opening branches of the bank. So we'll kind of go with that. So Maryland, what did they want? Maryland wanted to close the Second National Bank, we'll say. And then we're going to have some sort of controversy, right? So they wanted to close it, but what was the problem? So we could say that the Chief Administrative Officer, or James McCulloch, believed that the federal government had power to create the bank or something along those lines, right? So we'll say, but McCulloch, the CAO of the bank, believed Congress had the power to create the bank. And then McCulloch is the guy who is like indicted in this case, right? So because he disagrees with Maryland, he feels that he's wrongly convicted. So ultimately, he appeals his conviction up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS. Okay, so then we'll kind of go back over our sentence and make sure it reads okay. So it would go, Maryland wanted to close the Second National Bank. I'm going to add to that and say because they felt it was unconstitutional. That fits our sentence a little better. So Maryland wanted to close the Second National Bank because they felt it was unconstitutional, but McCulloch, the CAO of the bank, believed that Congress had the power to create the bank, so he appealed his conviction up to the Supreme Court. That works, right? So now we're going to go back and we're going to figure out what McCulloch wanted. So it says, James McCulloch, the Chief Administrative Officer of the Baltimore branch, refused to pay the tax. we could have also included that down here. Maybe I'll add that. So he refused to pay Maryland's tax. Or something like that. We could have also included that part over here. However you guys want to do it. This is really pretty flexible, okay? So McCulloch, we could say up here that he wanted to refuse Maryland's tax on the bank. But then Maryland courts convicted him, right? And so he felt he was wrongly convicted. And appealed. Okay. All right, so something along those lines. Now for our third subject, we could either use McCulloch or Maryland again, or in the background information, they talked a little bit about a few other people or a few other groups of people. So they talk about Hamilton, they talk about Jefferson, they talk about Madison, they talk about the people and this whole idea of implied powers. So I would pick one of those subjects for my third sentence. So maybe I choose Hamilton, right? You can choose whoever you want. Maybe I choose Hamilton as my third subject. And then I'll say, what did Hamilton want? What sort of challenges did he face? And then ultimately, what was the result? So in part one, you're never going to talk about what the Supreme Court decided or what they wanted. This is all of the stuff leading up to the Supreme Court actually hearing the case. So I'm going to let you guys figure out who you want your subject to be for this last box, and then what you want for your sentence there. But I should see nothing about the decision of the court. That is going to be summarized in part two. So in part two, I can kind of scroll down and I can read about the decision. Few things I want you to write about in the decision. I want you to tell me who they decided in favor of and what was the vote. So was it 5-4? Was it close? Or was it unanimous? So on and so forth. So it says the decision was unanimous in favor of McCulloch in the federal government. So that's what I'm going to put here. They decided in favor of McCulloch. And it's 9-0, unanimous. So I need both of those pieces. The other thing I want you to tell me is I want you to tell me who issued the opinion of the court. So the opinion is like the legal paper, essentially, that lays out the decision of the court. So in this case, it says Chief Justice John Marshall authored the opinion. So I'm going to add that. Chief Justice Marshall. You'll remember him from Marbury versus Madison. Okay. If I wanted, I could beef up that with more of this information about why, but that's largely going to be addressed in part 3, which is the legal reasoning for the decision. So first I'm going to talk about what the majority decided. And one thing that I can do is I can go back and I can look at the arguments for the winner, because those are largely the legal basis for the decision. So Under arguments for McCulloch, it says the necessary and proper clause permitted Congress to make laws as they see fit, and a law creating the national bank was necessary for the running of the country. So I might include something in here about the necessary and proper clause. Let's see, what else? It says the Constitution does not specifically say that Congress has the power to establish a national bank, but there's also nothing restricting the powers of Congress. I'm going with legal reasoning here, so I'm looking for specific clauses for the Constitution. So let's look back down at this decision piece. This decision piece talks about necessary and proper clause. It also talks about the court also ruled that Maryland could not tax the Bank of the United States. In their decision, the justices declared that the Constitution and the laws in pursuance thereof are supreme. That's called the supremacy clause that's talked about further up here under the constitutional text and amendments. So there's also that supremacy clause piece. Now, I would, instead of just listing these, give me full sentences or a little bit of information about how those clauses are applied in this case. And then the second piece here says majority of justices reached this decision, but what did the minority say? There is no minority in this case because it was a unanimous decision. So we're just going to write an A in here. And then what's the significance of this case? In other words, why are we still talking about this case? And so one of the major issues here was obviously, did Congress have the right to commission a national bank? But the bigger question at hand is really, did Congress have more powers than those that are explicitly listed in the Constitution? So in making this decision that's in favor of McCulloch in the federal government, the court has decided that the feds have powers not explicitly listed. In the Constitution. And that becomes the precedent. That becomes the norm, right? The precedent. This is the basis for implied powers. Congress can do things even though the Constitution doesn't say them word for word. Now next I'm going to make some connection to a foundational document. So the ones we've talked about so far are the Declaration of Independence, the Articles, the U.S. Constitution, Fed 10, and Brutus 1. So I think the easiest connection to make is probably the U.S. Constitution. And I'm going to say that's because it involved, different clauses of the Constitution or something like that. Give me a full sentence on this. The other thing I could maybe argue is this is related to Brutus 1, right? Because the anti-federalists were concerned of the federal government getting too powerful, and this would be a case that would definitely concern them, right? So you can pick whichever one you want and just include your explanation. And then for the last part here, you're going to pick one of these sections or the other. So you can decide if you want to make a comparison, fill out a Venn diagram about a non-required case. So the suggested case I have is hyperlinked here, Wickard versus Filburn. You can click on that, read about that case, and then create a Venn diagram comparing McCulloch versus Maryland to Wickard versus Filburn. Or you can explain how the issue of states legalizing marijuana relates to this case. What are some similarities and differences? And I've linked a newspaper article there as well, but you can do your own research too. So that is that. Once you have this filled out, you can turn it in and then get going on U.S. versus Lopez. Have a great rest of your day.